Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting episode of JavaScript Jabber. I am Steve Edwards, the host with the face for radio, as you can see, and the voice for being the mime, but I'm still your host. Today, due to last-minute time changes, we won't mention why, I am here with Mr. Eric Hanchett of Amazon AWS. You might have heard of Amazon. How are you doing, Eric?
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. And thanks for being amazing with the time slot too. I appreciate it.
No worries. For those of you who might have had the privilege and honor of listening to Views on Vue, I've talked to Eric a few times. Eric is rather prolific in the Vue community, and you can literally say that he wrote the book on Vue, or at least a book on Vue, back in the days of Vue 2, and now works for Amazon Web Services, incorporating JavaScript and into AWS, and we're going to talk about that. So, and you also might know him from his Program with Eric channel on YouTube and training courses and many other things he's done. So welcome, Eric.
Hey, thanks for having me, Steve. Yeah, I have, me and Steve hosted the Views on Vue podcast for many years, and I got to be a co-host for a little bit of that, and that was amazing. But I am not here just for Vue. I'm here for Next, React, Angular, Astro. I am every framework, a fan of every framework. So,
And before we go on, for those of you watching this or seeing the video later, we will try not to hold it against Eric that he's wearing a San Francisco 49ers jersey and just leave it at that. So anyway, okay, so let's talk. So for history purposes, for a while when Eric was getting up and going, he worked for an insurance company. And then this always cracked me up that you did all these Vue videos and Vue stuff, but you were doing Angular during the day at work. And then he moved over to Amazon and started working there. So why don't you tell us what you do at Amazon and how you incorporate JavaScript into what they're doing?
Yeah, for sure. I'll take one step back just to add a little bit more to that story. I was working at an insurance company, more like an insurtech startup. And I did push a lot for them to use Vue, but they were dead set on using Angular. They had a Java backend, so we ended up going with Angular. Luckily, before that, I got to work at a job where I did a lot of Java, but I kind of got to choose my front end, so I got to kind of dabble in a lot of things. So I had a little bit of time working on Ember, which was really fun. I think for the most part, we did just basic jQuery and HTML in the job before the insurance company. But it was fun to kind of test them all out. So when I moved over to AWS, Amazon Web Services, I was a part of a team, a front-end engineering team that used Vue. So that's one thing I kind of surprises some people when I talk to them about AWS. First is when you think of AWS, you probably think of DevOps, serverless, Lambda functions, infrastructure as code, Kubernetes. And it's fun to talk to them about, well, actually, AWS is a huge org. We have lots of different teams. And one of the teams deals a lot with front end. I mean, obviously, there's the front end Amazon.com website, but we actually create tools for front end developers. And so I was a part of a team we called ourselves the Amplify UI team that created these tools for developers to connect to AWS services. And one of the more popular ones in there was something called Cognito, and a part of AWS Amplify, which to give that a definition is that's our Amplify, our definition, our kind of motto for AWS Amplify is to help front-end developers create full-stack websites using AWS services. And so when I was using Amplify, or when I joined that team, we created a UI components library that made it easier to connect. We had something called connected components, and those made it easier to do common things that you would do on AWS. And one of them was to create an authenticator, and that allowed users to sign in, sign out, use multi-factor authentication, use federated logins. So I was responsible for creating the Vue version of that. And it was a really fun year and a half working directly in Vue, creating this open source library that is used by tens of thousands of developers, which is awesome. And then about a year ago, I moved into more developer advocacy, which is what I do now. And so what I do, my job now is to talk to as many people as I can about AWS Amplify, its services, how I can find solutions for people, and just kind of get the word out that that AWS Amplify and AWS in general is just not DevOps and backend only, and that Amazon.com website you order stuff for, but that we have amazing developer tools for everybody.
So one thing we clarified when we first talked about this was that basically this isn't a front end for you if you want tools to use if you want to build sort of your own back end. The idea is that you're using AWS services to build your web application or site for whatever it is. And so these tools make it a lot easier to do that, so you're not having to go in and manually configure a whole bunch of stuff. Is that a fair statement?
Right. Yeah, we have sane defaults. So let me get a little bit more specific. I've been kind of at 500 miles up right now. Let's go down a little bit closer to the service. So, for example, we have a service called Studio, which is like a drag and drop interface to create your backend. So, let's say you needed to add in authentication. You just kind of click a few buttons, adds authentication. You want to add in a database. And what we recommend is AWS AppSync, which is our managed GraphQL service. And then you can create your schemas all within there. And then you can download it into your app. You can also add forms. So that's like one service. One that's really, really popular is our AWS Amplify hosting. And so we saw that what other hosting companies doing, we wanted to do the same. So we have a hosting that works really well with Next 13, Next 14 for server-side rendering or static site generation. But you can also host any sort of static site on it that you'd like. And it's just a couple of clicks. You run a couple of commands in the command line, and you can push it up directly to Amazon services, and that's completely managed. So you don't have to necessarily know how to set up your CloudFront distribution, how to set up all the internals, and get the Lambda serverless stuff for Next. We do that all for you. So we have like more of a managed service. And then one new product that we just created, and it's in developer preview right now, is something called AWS Amplify Gen 2. And we're very focused on the front end developer experience. So in that case, you can create like your new Next app, and then through the command line, you can type a couple of commands and we'll auto generate a bunch of boilerplate code for you. Actually, it's not even that much of boilerplate code, but that code can be used as what we call infrastructure as code, and you can run it and it'll provision and create in the background using something called CloudFormation, a backend for you. So you can get everything for you can add in your identity provider, which is Cognito. You can add in AppSync and the schemas. You can also go down to what we call the Cloud Development Kit, and then add any other AWS services. And so we wanted to make it like very straightforward to use this command, generate it, and then create this code first experience to your backend. And then it connects. It almost has like a end-to-end TypeScript type safety feature where you can create your database and then have it available in your front end, the schema for that in your front end. So it's typically when you use GraphQL, you get some of that, but it's usually not TypeScript specific, but this is TypeScript specific. You can create an advanced schema for your backend, all your models, and then have that available in your front end. So those are kind of some of the things that we do at AWS Amplify. And thank you for putting the links on the screen too. That's very helpful.
I'm all about banners. They make life so much more fun. Okay, so let's go back and talk about a little of that. So databases, you said, now the GraphQL is obviously not your database. That's your way you connect to, that's your API, right? So what are the database types that you support? Obviously, there's your MySQL and your Postgres, right? I'm going to guess there's some sort of Mongo or document database option, or what other options do you have available?
Right. Well, there's a couple of things there. So depending on what sort of API that you want to set up for your backend, you have some flexibility. You can have a RESTful API that you can set up, and you can do that also with with AWS Amplify. You can create basically using our CLI utility, or using what I talked to you before, the Amplify Gen 2, and using something called CDK, or this infrastructure as code. You can create an API gateway and then have that API gateway connect to, let's say, a Lambda function. And then that Lambda function then can talk to any sort of backend database that we support. So we have SQL, NoSQL, Aurora, anything you want. DynamoDB is pretty popular. If you want to go the GraphQL route, then we recommend that you use our managed GraphQL service called AppSync, and then that defaults to DynamoDB. But you can connect other databases up to that as well if you need. So that's a few of the options, and you kind of have the flexibility of setting it up. If I was going to recommend something to someone who's listening right now, who kind of want to give AWS Amplify a spin, first, obviously, create your AWS account. There's a pretty hefty free tier. You can get hundreds and hundreds of hours, and even most of the services I'm talking about right now are on demand. So you only get charged when you use, hundreds of hours or have thousands of users. So usually the free tiers are pretty wide. But I would recommend to use the AppSync service. And what's really nice about it is, if you're familiar with GraphQL, you have to create resolvers. You have to kind of do all this connective tissue between the queries that are coming in and connecting them up to your backend. And then adding, if you have auth in, that's like another layer of complexity that you have to deal with. Well, what we have in the AppSync, we have this model schema where you just put whatever the data is .model, and then we'll create all those resolvers for you to do all the common things you would need to do with a GraphQL service, like create, read, update, and delete. And it kind of does that all for you. And of course, if you need to kind of get into those internals and change those, there's ways of overriding it. There's ways of creating your own custom resolvers. But for most people, if you just want to kind of play around, that's all there for you. So that's how I would start. I would obviously first make sure you have an AWS account and have that up and running. You'll need a credit card to start an AWS account, and then try out some AWS Amplify and use perhaps our Gen 2 product, and then create your backend using AppSync. Does that make sense? I know that's a lot there.
Yeah, it's a lot. So how about if I got something simple? You mentioned Astro, right?
Yeah.
And so Astro is and it's a tool that I've used and I really have used when I've worked on a static site. So it's one of those things that started out as a static site generator and seems to be growing a little more. The whole idea with Astro is that you're getting rendered HTML, but if you want to add islands of what's the term I'm looking for? Things you want to do, productivity, islands of code, islands.
Right. Right.
You can use a Vue component or React component or a Svelte component or React component or something like that, and drop it just in a certain region of your page. And now I know it handles server-side rendering, and it's handling more and more. It's been a while since I've talked to Fred Schott about what's going on with Astro. So that's a simple case, right? Maybe where you're using markdown files for your content, or you could do something a little more complex. And here's a question for you. One of the ways I have used Astro in the past is with a third-party CMS, headless CMS, such as Prismic. Is that something you can use and not encouraged? You'd rather you host on an Amazon type of CMS, if that's even available, or are those possibilities as well?
Yeah, you bet. So, like I mentioned earlier, one of our more popular service, and you don't have to buy in the whole ecosystem. If I'm talking right now and you're like, well, I don't need an API gateway, I don't want to connect to a database, you can kind of pick and choose what you want, and you don't have to know how to create all this infrastructure for you. So with our Amplify hosting service, our managed hosting, you can connect it directly up to your version control system or Git or GitLab, whatever you're using, and then you can push it up directly to there. And for Astro in particular, we can do it two different ways. We can do it as a static site. So you can push it as a static site during the build process. If you have it connected to Prisma, it could probably pull all that stuff in, kind of like a headless CMS, like you're talking about, and then you can just host it on the hosting, Amplify hosting. Or we do have something that I've been actually just testing out last week a community-led driven plugin to allow you to do server-side rendering on Amplify hosting was made available recently. So I'm still testing it out. It seems to work well. But what we did for Amplify hosting, we have most of our customers, a lot of our customers use Next 14, Next 13. We have that kind of automatically detects it. So if you have Next 14 and you want to do static site or server side rendering, it will automatically detect it. Everything will work great. If you want to use a different service, like let's say Astro or Nuxt, then we have community-led plugins that you include inside your source code, and then it'll be picked up by our hosting, Amplify hosting, and then it'll configure it so you can use server-side rendering and have those API routes work. So there's one for Astro, and then there's also integrations. I think it's up there. I haven't checked that website you just put up there, but there's also we partnered with the Nuxt community, and we were just talking before the show started with Daniel Rowe. He's an amazing contributor to the Nuxt ecosystem, and we partnered with him and the guys at Nuxt, and they created an adapter for us for Amplify hosting as well. So now you can use Amplify hosting with server-side rendering without any problems. So so that's definitely a use case, and you can certainly connect it to other services outside of AWS. We don't have any. It makes more sense when you can connect it. Like if you're going to have a bunch of infrastructure, kind of having one place to have it all in one place is nice. But you can't have it in multiple places.
There's a few adapters for AWS listed here. Looks like some of them are, I don't know, duplicates or do the same. There's deployed at Astro to AWS Amplify, and there's the Astro adapter of AWS serverless.
Let me see here. I'm looking at that webpage. Yeah, the one that says Astro-AWS-Amplify is the one I just tested last week, and that one worked great.
Right. Okay. That links to the GitHub repo. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's nice when you can just say, yeah, here, I'm going to use this host, drop this in, rock and roll.
Yeah. That's one thing that I've noticed too. And is I see these people, not these people, I see many different software developers out there posting on Twitter, X, about their stacks. And I always see like, I'm using X for authentication, and I'm using this service for my backend, let's say our monitoring, and I'm using this service for our database. And they have like, I'm just imagine when you're doing this, you have like 10 different services, you have 10 different bills coming in every month, and maybe you're in the free tier in this one, but you've gone over on this one. And I just think it just adds a bunch of complexity, and I'm all for like finding the best service for your needs. But I also see there is a niceness to having like one overarching company or service that handles multiple these things, and they all kind of integrate well together. So that could be a reason why you may want to look at a service like Amplify, where you can have it does multiple things and not just like one part of this bigger puzzle that you need.
To quote Lord of the Rings, so one service to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. Right?
Yes, but you don't have to. You can always pick and choose what you want.
So one of the things that you mentioned, and this has a separate page under the Gen 2.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if it's available here. It has to do with authentication.
Mm-hmm.
So just to clarify, there's a difference between authentication and authorization, right? So this is just handling the authentication, saying, okay, I'm going to let you log in and you're who you say you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it comes, it's not going to go so far as to allow you to define roles and permissions. In other words,
no, you can
what
do
is the
both.
extent of that?
Yeah,
Really?
You can do authentication and authorization. So you could set up special groups. You can add people to groups. It's pretty powerful. So Gen 2, just to recap what I said 10 minutes ago, is our new developer preview product that combines like infrastructure as code. So you can write your backend in code in a very straightforward way. We wrote it in such a way that just with a few lines of code, you can pop up your whole identity provider, create your whole backend GraphQL AppSync service together, and then you can drop down to CDK for other things. And we're also, before our it goes for what we call GA or general availability. We're looking to add even more functionality to it, so you can easily add in functions and several other things. But a part of that is this thing called auth, and then inside auth, we that's backed up by our identity provider, and in the Amazon system, that's Cognito. And then from there, you can do a whole bunch of things. You can add like multi-factor authentication. You can add identity providers. You can add multiple identity providers. But when you're thinking about authorization authentication, you can go into our schemas, and then you can tell it like have this table only have users from this group have access to it. You can do that kind of low level, field level customization of each thing that you send out. You can
That's very
also,
low level at the table
yeah,
level.
yep, you can even do the field level too, which is really neat. So if you wanted to only have this field, have this group be able to update it, you can. Or we can do owner based authorization. So let's say you have a table that's gets created every time a user creates a new account. So you want that only that user can update like their email address. But you want to make sure that no other person in your system can update that. And you can make rules like that. Or you can have an admin account that can update everything. So yeah, we do have those fine-grained authorization rules that you can add in, which is awesome. It gets quite complicated too. Like I've seen some of them where it's like you can even drop down to create your own custom authorization rules. So that way, if you're out, so we have these things called directives. They have these little at symbols, and you can add it to anything. Well, in our new Gen 2, it's more this dot notation. We can do dot authorization. You can add a bunch of things. But if you needed to, you can create your own custom resolver that only certain, and then you can dive into the code and do it that way as well.
So is the idea, and I'm going somewhere with this. So is the idea that all of this code that we're talking about uh, using and writing for authentication, authorization, and schemas and all this stuff, this is all written in JavaScript on your front end as compared, and AWS is basically your back end and you're just deploying there. Is that right, or what am I missing?
Yeah. So yeah, you got the right idea. So what we do with this Gen 2 product, it's all in TypeScript is kind of our default. We do support other languages, but for now we're focusing on TypeScript. And you would write the infrastructure as code. And then what we have things are called, after you write it, that is, then you can run a couple of commands on the command line and it gets deployed into what we call an ephemeral environment. So when in the background, it'll take that TypeScript code and it converts it to something called CloudFormation, which is read into by AWS. And then there's even a CloudFormation console that you can see what it's doing. And then it provisions and creates this whole backend for you. And then you can test locally for this ephemeral environment. And what's nice about it is you can set up and spin up an ephemeral environment for every single user that's using this, or for every single developer that's using this app. So let's say you have 5 developers. Everybody can download the Git repo. Everybody can spin up their own ephemeral environment and test locally against that environment. You can also share resources, share other things if you need to. There's a lot of different scenarios. And then you can kill those environments or stop those environments. And then once you're ready for production, you connect it to our hosting or we call it a console or hosting console. And then you can push it all up to that console, and then we'll create the production environments, and those will be tied back into your Git branches. So usually you have one for like develop or main, then those can be different production branches that you have. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
So, well, yeah. So that sort of goes to where I was going. I'm still a little hazy on the ephemeral stuff. Basically, is it basically an environment that has your assigned roles and permissions and accesses all that you can run locally against the services on AWS?
Yeah. So let's imagine a scenario here. Maybe this would be easier. So let's say you are in a 2-person team. You're 2 developers creating the next Instagram, and you decided to use AWS Amplify. and you run a couple commands in the command line, and it puts in generates these files on in your system, and they're in the same folder as your next apps. Your next is going to be your front end app, and from there you go into those files and you add in all basically in TypeScript. You add in the different tables, the different authorization rules, whatever kind of schema in the back end you want to look like. You can maybe add in your identity provider and all those rules there. Maybe you want multi-factor authentication, and then you push up to your, let's say, your GitHub version control system, and now the other developer, you both pull down the same repo, has the same information. You can both run a command on your command line that says npx amplify sandbox, and then all of a sudden it'll create a brand new environment with all defaults, no data in it, but with those rules and everything you added. And each user, developer one and developer two, can just spin up this ephemeral environment, and they can then put some seed data in it. You can then start testing locally against it and trying it out. Now, at some point, let's say both developers have been developing, they've made some changes to the back end, they're both in sync, they played around the ephemeral environments, they tested locally, it looks fine. They can then stop their ephemeral environments or keep them running, doesn't matter. And then they can push to a specific branch that's connected to our Amplify console. And then that will then push to production. And then you'll have a production environment that'll take that same spec that you had in those ephemeral environments, and it'll create that for like a production environment tied to that branch. And then from there, users can start using it in production.
Okay, so brings up a couple questions. One, so when you're developing, let's say we're using, MySQL as my database of choice for the given project. And you're talking about how I can seed data and so on. Is that database residing physically on my local? Can I point it there so I have access to there? Or is it always residing on AWS infrastructure? And that's where I have to access it.
Yes. So that's a good question. So when I say ephemeral environments, these are actual environments running on AWS in the cloud. They're not on your local computer. They're in the cloud. They're running there. And so, yeah, you would then have to seed that data in the cloud. We're looking at that too. That's a big use case we've heard back from our customers, is that when they want to use this, especially if they have like 6 developers, they don't want to have to like seed the data every time they stop and restart their ephemeral environment. So we're looking at ways you can share data better that way. But no, yes, those would be in the cloud. It's nothing local. So one thing we heard back in our previous versions of Amplify is that we had tools to like do mock servers and mock DynamoDB servers. And you can download that too. If you just Google around DynamoDB local, you can download like a local version of DynamoDB and you can connect it up to do testing. But we heard is like it was kind of difficult for people like to test their Lambda functions, to test their DynamoDB and GraphQL. And so one way to ensure that that's not an issue is to actually just create these ephemeral environments. So you actually are using the back end.
So it sounds like it's sort of a virtual machine type of environment.
No, it's real like cloud environment. Exactly. The only thing is that we designated like as a environment that can just be stopped at any time or destroyed at any time. But this is really like cloud data. It's not in some sort of VM or anything like that. So if the developer wants to test things out, they know that it's pretty close to what's going to be in production, because it's just we spun up all those provisions. So you're getting a brand new serverless, a brand new AppSync app, and brand new Cognito and whatever other services that you have in there.
So does this mean you can have, you talked about the deployment to prod, but you can, if you have your different branches, like, if you're using a Git flow type of workflow where you have main and then develop, and then you've got your feature branches, and when they're done, they go PR into develop and then the main and so on. But when you're in your feature branch, are you saying you can spin up environment in AWS to just test your code and have it like, here, go look, this is what my code's doing, go to this URL and you can see it? Is that how that can work?
So there's a couple things there. So let's say let's continue on with this analogy. So you're
Okay.
like these two developers doing this Instagram, and then there's a special new feature in Instagram, like I don't know, it's a sepia tone Instagram feature that you want to do.
Right.
So the developers, they create a new branch called sepia, and then they can still test locally. They can still create the ephemeral environments and test everything locally. Um, they wouldn't be able when you create the ephemeral environments, it's not creating like a hosting. It's not creating like a website or anything. It's just like provisioning some things locally that you can test. So when you run localhost, then it connects to those backend services. It's not creating like a hosting provider. But now let's say they tested locally. They're running localhost. They're running against this ephemeral environment. Everything's working great. They destroy their ephemeral environment. Now they're ready to go to push this feature to a feature branch, and they want to have like a small group of beta users test it. Then they run this command on the command line that pushes it to that branch. Well first basically they connect up that branch up to the AWS Amplify console, and you can tell the console like anytime you get a new merge request into this branch, rebuild the website. So then when they push to that new feature branch, it's going to create a new it's going to build the whole website and then deploy it into this special environment that you can then have. You can attach a URL to it. You could be like beta.mynewinstagram.com, or you can just have it. You don't even have to put a domain name if you want. And then you can have a small amount of people test it on that feature branch. And then at some point, maybe you don't need that feature branch anymore. You can delete it, and then that feature branch will be gone. That website will be gone, and you can continue on your workflow. Or maybe you merge that feature branch into your main branch, which then goes to your main domain, which is www.mynewinstagram.com.
Okay. So yeah, that's something I've used quite a bit when I was working at, much larger places where, whether it was Pantheon is the example I'm thinking before, where you got your branch, just spin up an environment. Yep, looks good. Okay, now we can merge it in and do everything.
Yeah, it's
Um,
the Git workflow is so popular. That's exactly what I did at that insurance technology company I was before. We had like four environments. We had one for QA. We had one for our like dev environment. We had a production environment. I think we even had like a second QA, no, a pre-prod environment. So we had four. So when we did when in this SureTech company, the way we did it is we would push to this is all AWS infrastructure back then too. We would create a feature, then it would like go into the QA branch, and that would have its own whole and servers and everything that was running against. And then if that worked well, we would promote it up to our first it would go in the dev, and if that worked well, we were ready. We'd send it to the QA, and then QA would go to pre-prod, and that's where like a bunch of stakeholders would get involved, like maybe our PMs or VPs, and then that would go into prod afterwards. So you could have that same type of workflow using Amplify Gen 2. You can create all four of those environments, all four of those branches, and instead of having to like have a DevOps guy to have to create all that infrastructure and create all this work, like it's all built. That whole workflow is built in to Gen 2.
so from a code standpoint, when you're developing, let's say I'm doing a Vue front end for,
Yeah.
whether it's inertia, whether it's, whatever. How much am I working on my local and pushing, and how much is not? So I'm assuming my whole view structure and my pages and view files and all that stuff is local, and that's what I'm committing to Git, which is getting pushed and then deployed to AWS. But on my backend stuff, my database, obviously any Lambda functions, without saying, and other stuff is all on AWS. And somewhere I've got some sort of connection strings or environment variables or something that are pointing to the different URLs for the different services, right?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So when you spin up the ephemeral environment, it creates like this JSON file with all your configuration strings in it, and your front end reads that, and the Amplify front end library reads it and like, oh, this is where my serverless function is. This is where the gateway is. This is where everything else is. Yep, you're right. Exactly.
Okay. So obviously, the benefit of something like this is that uh, it's somewhat portable, right? So if I got a new computer, my laptop goes up in smoke, as I thought mine was going to do a couple weeks ago. Um, then it's just a matter of cloning my local repo that has the front end code in it, firing it up, and as long as I have internet connection, I can connect to all my backend without having to, reinstall my SQL and reinstall Node. Well, I might need Node and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You wouldn't have to like. I know a really popular thing, especially a lot of DevOps guys like to bring up a like Docker container or Kubernetes locally. You don't have to do any of that. It's just push. You just pull everything down, run a couple commands, and then you can push everything back to the cloud to have your little local environment to test in. That's pretty straightforward. One thing you could do to your example is if you are using AWS, you do have to, if you have a brand new computer, there's some connection strings to AWS. There's some secret keys. You'd have to pull those back into your environment, and
Hmm.
and there's a few
Sure.
ways of doing that. There's a CLI way, but it creates like these dot AWS folder, and it adds these keys in, so that way when you run command line utilities, CLI utilities, that command line interfaces, that they'll just connect correctly to your backend to the AWS accounts. So you might have to
Is
do
that
some more work.
SSH type connection, or?
They are no, they're like different. So there's with with AWS Amplify, we have it's an npm command that you can run npx well, in the first time you're creating it, you run npm amplify at latest, npm create amplify at latest, and then it will create the infrastructure for you. And then when you first run npx amplify sandbox, which will create the sandbox ephemeral environment for you, that will look at those keys that are in like your root folder, and it'll look for them on your file system, or look for these
Hmm.
uh, var- variables
Hmm.
in your account, and then it uses the API to do some kind of credential swapping in the background. And it's not, I don't think it's SSH, but I think it has the general idea of like doing public and private keys, but I haven't looked into exactly that, how it does it.
Okay. Now, one thing you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the code that you're using for the infrastructure is that it's
Mhm.
TypeScript. So, if you're somebody like me who has not completely drunk the TypeScript Kool-Aid, is that's something I would need to get up to speed on in order to use the code as infrastructure?
Yes. So let me caveat that by saying we are focusing on TypeScript first for this developer preview. However, in the future, we are looking at other languages for people who aren't TypeScript people. If you are looking for something that's other than TypeScript, now this isn't AWS Amplify, but I mentioned earlier something called Cloud Development Kit. It's called AWS CDK. It's kind of the acronym for it. Now that will work with more than TypeScript. So it has most people use TypeScript, but you can use Java, you can use uh, Python, you can use a whole bunch of other frameworks, uh, programming languages to use it with. So you don't have to know TypeScript for that case. So if you want to do CDK, now the difference between CDK and what I'm talking about with the Amplify Gen 2, CDK is much more, it's very powerful, but it's a lot more a terse. I don't know. It's very specific. It has a very specific language. It has a little bit higher of a learning curve. It's very powerful. But what we wanted did what we when we did with Gen 2 is we kind of added another what we call a construct on top of it, kind of like another layer of abstraction that made it much more straightforward to use, rather than having to learn all these little commands. And there's even a lower level than CDK, which is CloudFormation, which is, I would say, very powerful, but you would really have to learn all the different nuances of CloudFormation to use it. And those are all
Okay.
infrastructure as tool codes, to infrastructure as code tools.
There you
It's a
go.
mouthful.
Okay. Right. Uh, okay. Before we move on, anything else from a back-end infrastructure standpoint that I want to talk about?
No, I think you covered most of it. Hopefully, that was useful for people listening at home to kind of get an idea of of how it's working. I think that's a big part of the Amplify Gen 2 product. The other half is our end-to-end type safety, which kind of takes the types from the back end and has them available in the front end. You may have heard of other products like TRPC. For those in the Next ecosystem, you may have heard of it. So we have similar things like that where you can create a back end and have the types available in the front end. So that way you never receive something you don't expect or send something you don't expect. So it's all typed correctly. That's a pretty powerful use case as well.
All right. Now, one other tool that we talked about, and we've talked about, you and I have talked about on some of the Views on View podcast, was some of the component library stuff
Yeah.
that you had worked on. In particular, I remember we talked about the Vue ones, obviously. Can you talk a little bit about those and what they do? I know we talked about authentication and stuff, but aren't there also, stuff for simple like forms options and things like that when creating Vue that tie into AWS, or what's the extent of those?
Yeah. So the if you go to, and I will bring it up as I talk to you, ui.docs.amplify.aws, we have this full component library, and there's really two parts to it. Well, first, the component library that we support a lot of different types of frameworks. We have Android, Angular, Flutter, React, React Native, Swift, and Vue. For a full component library, we have it for React. And so what I mean by that is we have all sorts of things like dividers, headings, icons, alerts, loaders, messages, placeholders, links, buttons. You can't have a UI framework without a button, UI component framework without a button, I should say. That's pretty much standing. We also have a complete theming system, so you can theme it. But what I think when people ask us is, why should I use this over Shad CDN or Shad CN or in the Vue ecosystem like Vuetify or Tailwind Prime View, which it's pretty cool UI framework, is
Mhm.
that we have what are called connected components. So these connected components, there's really 4 or 5 of them that we have now. One is the authenticator, and this authenticator is available not just for React, but you can get it for Vue, Angular. That's kind of like our biggest use case for this UI component framework. And what that allows you to do is it's just with a few lines of code, you can add in with a few lines of boilerplate code, you can add in this kind of almost like a widget, this piece of code, this authenticator, which is a way you can use to log in, log out, sign up, sign in. It has it built into our AWS services, our Cognita service. So you can do social sign-ins, Facebook logins, Amazon logins, and it's just a few lines of code to add all that in there. And that's what a lot of people use because to create a full authentication system for your website, it's a lot
Oh.
of work to add in that login page. Have you done that before, Steve?
No, no, I've heard horror stories about it. I'd like to use stuff like Laravel that handles all that for me on my back end. So I don't want to create an authentication system from scratch.
Exactly. And there's two pieces of it. It's like writing the back end part of it and using something like Laravel, and then a lot of people use Passport.js or
Mhm.
Nextauth or something like that. And you kind of have to write all that code yourself. And so that's one big part of it. And then the other part of it is like, oh, let's add a login page, a forget your password page, a sign up page. How do we redirect once we're signed in? How do we do a lot of things? So that's kind of one of our bigger use cases is this authenticator, and we have a lot of ways to customize it too. So if you don't like the way it looks, you can completely change the look and feel of it. You can use our theming system to change it. And then the other connected component that we have, and this is for React only, but in the future we are looking to add it for like Vue and Angular and other frameworks, is our account settings. And what this does is you can add like the change password and delete user. So you add this little snippet of code, and then you get this box on the screen that anybody you can use to change their password after they're logged in. Delete users, the same thing. Maybe have an admin user that needs to delete everybody. You instead of having to write all this code, you can just add this component onto your page, And I should say component better than widget. People, so when I say widget, people think of like old school applets or something. No, no, I'm talking about like essentially a component that's
Well,
written
that
in
brings
the
back some memories.
Yep. It's basically a component that's written in the framework so that it has all the idioms of that framework. For example, in Vue, you have templates and you have slots, but in React, we have different types of props, and we have children. So we try to use the kind of what you know and love from that framework with these components that you can pull in. I can go through a few others. We have face liveness, which is our Amplify UI face liveness detector, which uses in the backend our Amazon recognition face liveness service to help determine if a user is real or not. So there's some specific applications where people might use this. We also have Geo, which is a way to add like maps onto your app, kind of like Google Maps, where you can do all sorts of mapping fun. And then storage, which is probably our second most popular component, connected component, which allows you to do like S3 uploads. It's like a file uploader, so you can
Like
upload
a drag and
files.
drop type of UI type thing?
Yep, you can drag and drop files directly to public, private, or protected S3 buckets, and we have a nice interface for that. And then we have a storage image, which connects to S3 to show images on your page. And then we have one last one. It's called in-app messaging, which allows you to do in-app messages in your app. So that's a lot
Now,
there, but there's so we've been continuously adding more and more features to our UI component framework library.
so are these things that I could use piecemeal as well? If I have a large, Vue app that I'm already using and I hook it up to AWS and I want to be able to stash uh, images in an S3 bucket, is that something I can use by itself, or does it have to be used in the context of a larger framework?
Yeah, you can certainly. You would have to obviously have an AWS account. You would have to
Right.
set up Amplify. But yeah, after you did those two things, you can then just use that one piece of it. You can just do the file upload. You can use the file. You can use our storage manager or file uploader and start uploading files directly to S3. Yeah, and that's
Excellent. Excellent.
and I don't know if I finished this point, but what I was trying to say is that that's one of the reasons you may want to consider using something like AWS Amplify is the UI component framework part is that we have these connected components that kind of take away all that time it takes to write all the connecting code to all these AWS services, and we do that all for you. And then we have a nice, very customizable, themable component that you can add to your project.
So the themability stuff that, if I have a component, obviously I'm probably not going to want to use it off the shelf, or maybe you're like me and you're lazy and you do. So you're going to want to tweak it to fit your brand or your look, your theme for your particular application. What's the framework that you're using for that? Is that like a custom AWS type of framework, or is it something like a Tailwind or Bootstrap, or how does that work?
We have with our theming. So any of these connected components we're just talking about, this authenticator and app messages, or even if you're just using buttons or whatever from this component library, it's all connected to our theming, and you can create what's something called a theme provider. And this is all built by us. We're not using Tailwind or anything like that, but it's based on several design principles that are pretty common in frameworks like design tokens, and we use breakpoints and overrides. So everything in your app is essentially all the themes in your app are design tokens that you can override at any time, and you can make multiple different themes, and then you can change the colors, the typography, sizes. You can have different responsive layouts, so you can have it built into the components that when it hits a certain screen size, it automatically changes. Of course, we have dark mode because you can't have a UI component framework without a button in dark mode. We have that as well. And then you can everything kind of boils down to CSS variables. So you can change if you didn't want to use the theming itself, you can override the CSS variables, and change them to whatever you want. And that includes all the colors, disabled colors, the primary colors, everything like that. Or you can use design
Does it
tokens.
So is he using like atomic classes? You know, that whole Tailwind. I think one of the ones that started it, where you have one class does one thing, as compared to one class that does 20 different things.
I would say not in the traditional sense that you thinking of, like in Tailwind with the atomic
Mhm.
uh, classes. It's more along the lines of a traditional kind of app where you have multiple different variables that make up one thing. No, it's not like that. No.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Awesome. That's a lot of stuff to talk about. Anything regarding Amplify and JavaScript that we miss that you want to cover?
No, I think that covers most of it. I would highly recommend if you're listening, yeah, check it out. This isn't sponsored or anything. It sounds like it's kind of sponsored, but it's not. No, I just Steve is just having me on and just talking about fun technology. So, but yeah, no,
Yeah.
I really think that AWS Amplify is a great product, and it's hopefully more people can check it out.
The correct industry term, I think, is called one big long shameless plug, but that's okay because obviously this is a well battle tested infrastructure. You know, at AWS, they've been around for a long time. So
Yeah.
when they make it easier to build your app on top of their provided services, that's a win for a developer for sure.
Yep.
And so before we wrap up, let's talk about your work as a DevRel. We mentioned you initially were started as a developer and then moved into the developer relations role. So besides coming on the best podcasts out there like this one,
Mhm.
what are the other things that you do in your day to day?
It's more like what I don't do. Developer
Okay.
advocacy is it's an emerging field. Essentially, what we're trying to do is connect with developers. We're not. I mentioned I joked about being a salesperson. I'm not trying to be a salesperson. More, what I'm more interested in is just trying to get more people to try the product out, to check it out, to give me feedback, to listen to it. We're not marketing people, and so a lot of my job is to create content. Like I create blog posts and videos, come on podcasts like this. I do a fair bit of community stuff. I can be a part of a community. I'll come and talk to them. Actually, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be at AWS Sacramento, which I'm really looking forward to do a workshop on something we just talked about today, this Amplify Gen 2. So it's a lot of creating content. It's a lot about connecting with people. Part of my time too now is going to conferences. So last year I went to 11, I think it was like 10 or 11 different conferences all around the US, all
Dang.
around US and Canada. I didn't go Europe, but maybe this year I'll go to Europe. And so I got to talk to a ton of people
Yeah.
and just and find out like what the developer community is doing, what's working, what's not, what are they excited about. Some of my jobs posting on Twitter and just and reading other people's tweets, posting on any service that people talk about software development. I've been trying out TikTok lately. I feel like I'm too old for TikTok, but I'm on there. And it's funny. It's funny. There is some developer influencers on TikTok that like dance and they talk about AWS services. And it's a really fun place. So I'm trying to. It's a lot of different things you can do, but it's a lot about getting awareness out there. It's a lot about talking about products and talking to developers. And so I love it. I did before I was before I was doing more developer advocacy role, developer advocacy work. I was a front end engineer and I did back end engineering, but I always like created YouTube videos and created content. And I found that I just really liked doing that. It was just kind of a weird thing. It's kind of like the fun of like teaching someone teaching someone. You don't even have to be an expert, just teaching just a little bit more than the next person of what you found out, and then having people respond back to you, talk to you. It's just such a fun feeling to do that, and something I really love and I really like doing. So I think this job kind of fit really well into that because I had been doing some sort of developer reach, either going to conferences, creating YouTube videos, writing books for years now, and so this kind of all fit into place.
Awesome. Yeah, that would be fun. I've heard the upsides and downsides to that. I think, you and I have talked before on Views on View regarding conferences and how awesome conferences can be, just in terms of, and yes, I'm going to get to View Conf. I will at some point, I promise. But just how you can meet people and put names to faces, and the hallway track and all that kind of stuff. The downsides that I've heard from some people is just a crazy amount of travel. I mean, at some point, travel's got to get a little wearying, I would imagine.
Yeah, you're right. It is quite a bit of travel. I try to put some guardrails for my travel. I try not to travel on the weekends, although I am traveling the weekends in a month from now. But most of the time, I don't travel on the weekends. I try to be home by Friday by 5 p.m. so I can be with my family. And I have 2 kids, so I tried not to do that. And I also try not to travel more than like once or twice every couple of months, few months. It can get to the point, though. I heard some developer advocates where they're traveling every single weekend, every
Uh,
single week, or maybe 3 times a month. That's too much. Like that's crazy. Yeah, and that does wear on you. And also just getting out there. I'm more of an introvert in a lot of ways. It took me a long time to get out of my shell to talk to people, especially being a developer. You just sit in front of a computer all day. You don't really interact too much. That's not true. You do have meetings and you do talk to a lot of people, but for the most part, when you're in your zone, you're by yourself in front of your computer. And so getting past that too, at the first wasn't too much of a struggle because I've been doing videos and stuff for a while. But even some days I'm like, do I want to go out and meet people? It's that those are some of the negative things too. Yeah, and travel certainly can be one of them.
yeah, I used to back a long time ago. I used to travel just twice a month, and that was quite a bit. It was nice when you had all the frequent flyer miles and you got the upgrades and the Delta medallion, gold medallion stuff. No travel lounges and all that, but still, travel is travel
Yeah,
for
it's
sure.
I have talked to other people too that travel way more for me, and I'm always getting like tips too, like what's the best credit cards to get, where's the best places to go when you're at X city, when to get to the city, when to leave.
Right.
There's a lot of travel hacks that I'm learning more and more about. But like I said, I try to limit it, not to have it be all encompassing because that's no fun.
Cool. Alrighty. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up and move to picks. Thanks, Eric,
Yeah,
for coming on yet again. Talk about AWS. Oh, one quick question before I forget. You said you
yeah.
blog. Where do you blog at?
I
What's
used to
the
blog at
Oh, that's
programwitheric.com.
right. Hmm.
So if you go there, you'll find some very old articles. But I am thinking about starting it up again. Well, I recommend everybody though. We'll probably get to this again at the end, but eric.video is just goes directly to my YouTube or Twitter at eric.ch is like the best way to get a hold of me.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Program with Eric on YouTube. There's a lot of videos out there. And he has really great
Yeah.
thumbnails on his videos too. I'm jealous. If I could do
I
those, I would do more videos. So gotta have the thumbnail. All right. So with that, we'll move to picks. I'm assuming you remember that, Eric, and have picks
yeah,
for us.
I have
Okay.
I have one I just thought of.
Okay. Well, I'll go first and give you time to get that prepped. Uh, you know, for those of you that are regular listeners, you know that my dad jokes are the highlight of any podcast episode. But first, I have a legit pick that well, I take that back. I have a pick that isn't a dad joke. Let's not demean my dad jokes. It's a great article I saw on Hacker News. It's called "Why You've Never Been in a Plane Crash" by someone named Kyra Dempsey, who normally blogs about aviation incidents under the name of Admiral Cloudberg. And the article is all about how blame is handled after an aviation incident. And it's really fascinating. And I've seen this before, and it makes a lot of sense. Uh, in the article, the given incident that talks about happened at LAX, Los Angeles International Airport, in 1991, basically where a 737 was landing. And when it landed, it completely crushed a commuter plane that was sitting on the runway. And uh, I think 19 people died, and it was really bad. And right away, the cause, and this flight controller admitted to it, was that she had um, left the commuter plane there. She forgot that she had told the plane, "Yeah, stop right here," and then she had another plane say, "Yeah, it's okay to land," right where that commuter plane was sitting. And so the point of the article talks about how the aviation industry, when something like that comes, you don't, NTSB does not have power to file charges or make, manslaughter or murder charges or something like that. The whole goal when it comes to aviation is figuring out, why did this happen? Um, and people are going to be more willing to talk and open up and talk about everything that had happened if they don't think they're going to be charged with something. And in this particular, it's quite a long article, but later on down in the article, it talks that what they figured out, there was like 6 different things in terms of equipment that wasn't working, a custom built system that was, where they had to find custom parts, information that was supposed to be made available to her that wasn't available, that she had to go searching for, a whole bunch of different things. And so as a result of that, they were able to uh, figure out what the problems were and address them. And this lady, the air traffic control person, was offered a chance to come back and chose not to, probably because she was so traumatized by this. But just a really interesting article about how, when things go wrong, how much more you can get when your first inclination isn't to point a finger and say, "You screwed up, you were wrong, you're going to pay." So again, it's called "Why You've Never Been in a Plane Crash" by Kyra Dempsey.
I love that.
Now,
I was gonna say I am a huge fan of, I guess not a huge fan, but I like all those air disaster TV shows, like Air Disasters on Smithsonian.
mhm,
I think it's called Mayday in Canada, and
mhm,
it breaks down like every single flight. Every episode's like a different crash, and then you hear about the NTSB and the black
mhm.
boxes and how they investigate it. So I'm always interested in that stuff. Very, very, very fascinating. Why it's so much safer to travel today than it is back, 100 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah, and that's part of what this article talks about, is because they're not assigning blame and they're just figuring out what went wrong. Let's fix it. Then that tends to make things, much safer as compared to just, you screwed up and now someone's gonna clam up and not tell the truth because they don't want to get thrown in jail. You
As someone that now travels a lot more and is constantly on flights,
know.
I'm like, thank goodness that people are like that and that article exists.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, this Kyra Dempsey, if you look up Admiral Cloudberg, does a lot of writing. That's real detailed stuff on aviation incidents. And if you read the comments on Hacker News, they talk about certain YouTube videos, like you said, where they go in and just break down all the details. There's one that, yeah, I read before. So it was 1978, when I was pretty young. It was December 28th of 1978. There was I forget the model of plane, but was coming into Portland and crashed probably just a couple miles from my house in a very heavily suburban area. And the pilot was very good, either good or fortunate or a combination of both, and landed in this wooded area between two like developments, right off a major street here in Northeast Portland, and actually farther out towards where I live. And if you read the NTSB report on it, it talks about how, basically, I can't remember if he ignored it or was unaware that he was low on fuel, because he had tried to come into Portland and had to circle for a while. And during circling, he ran out of fuel and realized, "Uh-oh, I'm out of fuel, got to crash." And so he was managed to bring it in for that. But I can still remember that night and remember the crash and reading about it. It is quite fascinating stuff if you're into, like,
Wow.
probably like most developers are, debugging and
Yeah.
figuring out what went wrong and how to avoid it. So excellent. All right, so on to the dad jokes of the week. Um, when I was younger and in school, I went up to my teacher one day and I said, "Would you punish me for something I didn't do?" And my teacher said, "No, of course not." I said, "Okay, I did not do my homework."
Nice.
Right? So I had a friend named Jimmy, and Jimmy bought an electric car, and he was really excited about it. And then he bought an electric blanket, and then he bought an electric guitar, and then he bought an electric chair. I haven't heard from him in a while. Got to give credit to Stephen Wright for that one. He was on Colbert's show, late night show, and told that one. And he's been my all-time favorite comedian since the '80s. And then finally, I went to the store the other day and was just getting some milk, which I had to do when we got hit with ice and there wasn't much left in the stores because everybody was buying them out or their refrigerators had all gone bad. And as I was checking out, the checker asked me, "Do you want me to put this milk in a bag?" I said, "No, that's okay. Leave it in the jug."
Love it.
So those are my picks. What do you got, Eric?
I saw that the Apple Vision Pro was just released. Have you seen this thing, Steve?
I have heard about it. I have not seen it.
So think of it like VR, the ultimate VR goggle made by Apple. You can it adds like when you have it on, looks like there's like a 1,000-foot screen in front of you. I mean, it has all these features. Like you can navigate simply by using your eyes and hands. You may have seen this little gesture in the commercials. I want to try it out. Like this looks really neat. I think it's in pre-order.
It's pretty spendy. It's like $2,000, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's the 256 gigabyte model is $3,499.
Oh, good Lord.
But you can get the terabyte for almost $4,000. So yeah, it's not cheap, but it looks kind of like the ultimate geek gift. I want to go in. So like we just said, I travel a lot. I want to see. I haven't traveled in a little bit in the last couple of months, but I wonder if I'll start seeing them at when I'm traveling on airplanes, where people just like pop them in and be watching movies. That'll be really cool. Maybe if I see someone, I'll ask them can I borrow your $3,500 device to try it out for a few minutes? I don't know if that'll work. But
well, you work for Amazon. They got money. They can pony up one, right? And as a DevRel, you deserve it.
I think I saw somewhere. Yeah, go ahead.
Hopefully you don't see somebody like, reaching out and doing something like that. Like they're playing a game or something like that. Smack the person next to them on the plane. I can see that happening.
I think there is some sort of connection you can do AWS with the Vision Pro. And maybe even with Amplify. I haven't looked into it. I thought I heard that.
Oh.
Anyways.
So how would that work? I
have no idea. No idea. Yeah, I think there might be something with Xcode. I just Googled it real quickly. And you can maybe create software for the device.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's my first pick. I'm all for the world where in 50 years from now we all have our VR headsets and we're just walking around or staying at home and we don't have to go anywhere. We're just on our VR headsets all the time.
Spoken like a true introvert. What can possibly go wrong?
I'm just kidding. No, that sounds dystopian.
You ever seen Wall-E, by the way?
Yeah, that's where we're going, I guess. That's where we're heading. That's my only pick other than go Niners. It's as of this recording, they have made it to the Super Bowl. And it's going to be tough. Mahomes looks really, really good. Kelsey, it's on fire. Could go either way. But I'm going to take
if you saw all the maps, you see all the maps and the memes ahead of the game, and it shows map of the U.S., for instance, it would say, okay, who's cheering for San Francisco versus who's cheering for Detroit? And it would be like this little area around San Francisco, and then the rest of the country's cheering for Detroit. And the same with the Ravens and the Chiefs. I personally would have preferred the Lions versus the Ravens. My team, the Cowboys, screwed up again, as always. Thanks, Jerry. But I'm just going to say this: Detroit gave you a gift. Be happy with it.
Yeah, we definitely got some good luck there in the second half. I would say the whole week leading up to the NFC Championship game, it felt like, even though the 49ers were overdogs, they were kind of the leading favorites.
No, they were underdogs. Overdogs before.
they were leading in Vegas. If you looked at the point spread, I think there were 7-point favorites.
Yeah,
and of course they just barely pull it out. But if you look at the national scene, I think everybody was rooting for the Lions because they've never been there. It's a Cinderella story. It was amazing what
Cinderella
they've done,
story coming
but
from
they
out of
just
nowhere. It's in the
didn't get it
hole.
done. So now we got the two not as favored teams, not as popular teams. But hey, I'll take it.
That was Bill Murray from Caddyshack, for those who might not have recognized my impression. Anyway, all right. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks for coming, Eric. Always a pleasure to have you here. Any questions? Bug him at Eric CH, Eric with a K, CH, on Twitter. Program with Eric. And Eric, what was it? Eric.video?
Yep.
All right. And he will answer your questions. Thanks for coming, everybody. Talk to you next time.